Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, November 21st, 1977, it is the fourth and final day of the National Women's Conference. The National Women's Conference was the conclusion of a years-long government-backed effort to support women's issues. The Gerald Ford administration had allocated some $5 million to set up a series of regional conferences and events culminating in this multi-day gathering in Houston, Texas. Gloria Steinem was there, Coretta Scott King, Maya Angelou, First Ladies Rosalind Carter and Lady Bird Johnson. Lawmakers like Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm were there, along with 2,000 women delegates from states and territories across the country. So picture it, it's very similar in many ways to a political convention. There were speeches and breakout sessions and a formal platform, which we will discuss at the end of it. And remember when I said that this was the fourth and final day of the National Women's Conference? Well, when I say final, I mean final, because the 1977 conference was the only one. That's it. They did it once, and they haven't done it since. So let's look back at this remarkable event, try and place it in some of that context about women's rights of the era and the women's rights movement of the era, and talk about why it never happened again. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Have either of you ever attended like an academic conference that did it once and then bailed and never did it again?
I mean, there are one-off conferences. I don't think I've been to one where it was like, oh, we're going to do this. And then they were like, oh, no, we're not going to do this.
Well, actually, it's a one-time thing. No, unless it's like a celebration. Like I've been to retirement conferences, and
Right.
That's kind of like a one and done.
Yeah.
But nothing that has the promise of repeating and then just collapses. No.
So we'll talk about why this collapsed, or even if collapse is the right word. I mean, certainly there were troubles here, and there was a reason they didn't do it again. But I mean, it's not like an abject failure. It's much more about the kind of larger context in which the women's rights movement and conversation was happening. So maybe we should start there with that context. I mean, we've talked a lot on this show about the origins of the National Organization for Women in the early 70s. We've talked about sort of feminism 1.0. We've talked about Chisholm's run. We've talked about the bra burning, or the apocryphal bra burning that took place in the late 60s. So by the time we get to 1977, where do things stand, Niki? And what is your sense of kind of why the Ford administration of all is adding material support?
So the Ford administration is part of this because up until very recently, the Republican Party had been the party of feminism and the party of women's rights. Throughout most of the 20th century, it had been the Republican Party at the forefront of that. And only as the Democratic Party became more liberal did it also become a home for it, and as the Republican Party becomes more conservative. So Ford is sort of sitting at the intersection of a Republican Party in which kind of moderate Republicans, certainly liberal Republicans, are having their last gasp. He's married to Betty Ford, who is a big proponent of the women's movement. And so I think that it makes sense in sort of that Republican Party for Ford to be not only open to, but celebrating an international women's conference like this.
Yeah, and putting money behind it. I mean, that's a really big deal, too, putting $5 million behind it, which doesn't sound like a lot of money now, I guess you could say, but it's something where usually it's just an endorsement and that's it. I think putting money behind something shows that at least you're moderately invested.
So part of the inspiration for this was there was a UN-backed event 2 years earlier, which established the International Women's Year of 1976, and then I think here we are into 1977, and it did start International Women's Day in March, which continues to this day.
It does.
Yes, it does.
It does.
We're still here.
I know.
You guys, you're still around, huh?
No, right?
But you get a day. So, no.
A whole day
A whole
for
day.
all of the women in the globe.
So I mentioned, all the people, a number of the people who were there. In addition to the 2,000 delegates, you have Gloria Steinem, Coretta Scott King, Maya Angelou, Rosalind Carter, Lady Bird Johnson, Shirley Chisholm, Barbara Jordan. I think in listing that, you can read it a couple ways. You can read it as one saying, oh my gosh, what an incredible gathering of people coming together from lots of different perspectives. Or you can say, oh gosh, just in that list of names, you see the cracks starting to show among the state of the movement. So which do you want to focus on?
To me, it's very much a who's who of the women's movement, I will say. But I think you have a lot of different factions being represented. You have white feminists, you have black feminists, you have a civil rights icon in Coretta Scott. You have Shirley Chisholm has, at this point, she's already run for the presidency, but you have sort of like the pinnacle of black women's political power. And, Gloria Steinem being there. I mean, this is, as much as it is a who's who, it's also the like representative figures of each different faction. Do you know what I mean? Socially, politically,
racially,
that are coming. Racially. Yeah.
Well, and it's one of those things where they don't know where they are in the movement. They're coming off of so many wins, right? The Roe v. Wade is decided in 73. There's a slew of legislation for protecting women's rights, women's economic rights. Women can get credit cards now. There are all of these things that have happened.
Birth control.
Yeah. Birth control for unmarried women finally becomes a thing in the early 1970s. And this idea that maybe this is where we hash out some of the remaining differences over reproductive rights, and some of the remaining differences over sexuality. Because this had been kind of a big point of tension in the movement between straight women and lesbians in particular. I think largely, but not exclusively, between white straight women and lesbians. But this idea that who belongs, and some of the most prominent people like Gloria Steinem were a little gatekeepy about it.
So the New York Times sort of sums it up as the conference goes on and as they work towards a platform, and these questions, particularly I think around sexuality and race and class, sort of come to a fore. The New York Times writes a piece in which they say there were tears, jeers, bitter disagreement, and radically polar speeches before the resolutions on reproductive freedom and sexual preference were passed and made part of the national agenda for women's equality that is being worked out at the event. So we can get a sense of how raucous it was internally. And again, I think it reminds me a lot of political conventions, right, where you see this stuff hashed out for better and for worse. The other element here, though, right, you have this internal fissures, and then you have external pressures as well. And I think if anyone remembers this moment, they probably remember actually the backlash to this more than the actual sort of fractures within. So this is where I think we walk onto the stage, someone who's come on to been a part of our show a number of times.
Introducing
Phyllis Schlafly is here, right? So Phyllis Schlafly is a conservative leader, a woman, but she has sort of launched a movement in the early to mid-70s that is geared towards protecting the traditional place, as she sees it, of women as homemakers, fighting against abortion, limiting government welfare and social support. And she really keys in on this event and basically launches a major counter. I don't even know if it's a protest. I mean, it just feels like a sort of counter
campaign.
Yeah.
I mean, this is what we call it in the black vernacular. It's like sometimes it be your own kind, sometimes it be your own kin. This idea of listen, women are not a monolith. Full stop. That's obvious. But Phyllis Schlafly represents everything that is sort of antithetical to the feminist movement, and not only is she in disagreement, but fierceful opposition to the achievements that the women's movement has made, and any additional ground that it might make politically or socially or economically or racially. She's stopping all of that. And I've tried to actually think of I don't know, who's our Phyllis Schlafly now, but there's always a person who is of the same kind that works to undermine what other people are doing within the group. So if you think about Black Americans, it's Booker T. Washington or something like that. There's or even a Clarence Thomas or whatever. But you always have that one person that's look, she's a woman. She doesn't want this, and that's who Phyllis Schlafly is.
Right. No, I think maybe Caitlyn Jenner for the trans movement now. I think the problem with trying to find a new Phyllis Schlafly is now there are 1,000 Phyllis Schlaflys.
True.
You know, Schlafly is somebody who is a professional woman, someone who'd run for office before, someone who had this robust public life outside of the home, and who in the early 1970s turns her attention to opposing the women's rights movement. And she founds this organization, Stop ERA, Stop Taking Our Privileges, and makes the argument that women had been protected by the law and that equality actually meant losing ground. And so she sees something like this International Women's Conference as a way of saying, hey, if we show up there, we can sort of be the face of all of the women who don't want any of this, who don't want equality, who don't want access to all of these things because we're protected by men. And if you take that away, then we'll be out there on our own. And that's the case that she kind of brings in a very snarky, media savvy kind of way. And, you know, at this point in time, Schlafly is well on her way to winning. I mean, the thing that she was opposed to, the Equal Rights Amendment, which passed out of Congress in 1972, seemed to be on its way to just like sail straight through to ratification. And check your constitutions.
Yeah.
It's not there. No. And it's not there because of Phyllis Schlafly.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Jody. I want to take a moment of your time. And I don't know if I've ever talked about where the idea for this show came from, but about 4 years ago, I left a full-time job to strike out on my own as an independent podcast producer. And the first thing on my wish list was to make a show with Radiotopia, because I knew it was the home for independent podcast creators, and some of my favorite audio makers in the world make their home here at Radiotopia. And in those 4 years, I, along with Niki and Kellie and Jacob and Brittany and you, our listeners, have been able to make exactly the show we want to make. And I'm including you on that list because you are part of this too, not just because you listen and send us comments and ideas, but because some of you have also decided to become members of Radiotopia. And that step from listener to member supporter makes all the difference in the world. So yes, it is the Radiotopia fundraiser right now, and I'm here to try and ask you to take that step from listener to member. Media is in a very rocky place right now, as I'm sure you know. The world is, too, in a pretty rocky place. And in the same way that I hope this show can help us navigate the crazy state of the world right now, support from listeners helps us try and navigate the very choppy financial waters we face as well. Making this show over the last 4 years has been a real honor. We want to keep making it, and we can only do that because of Radiotopia members. If you want to become a member, now is the time. It is the Radiotopia Fall Fundraiser. We have a goal of reaching 2,024 donors. It is 2024. And we're asking you to visit radiotopia.fm/donate. Go to radiotopia.fm/donate. You can learn lots more about how your work will help support Radiotopia. See all the different shows that you will be backing. Once again, that's radiotopia.fm/donate. Every little bit helps. And on behalf of the whole team here, thank you for your ears and thank you for your support.
The 2024 election is upon us, and the stakes couldn't be higher. But the outcome might not be clear till long after everyone has voted. If the race ends up being as close as it looks right now, we could be in for a repeat, or worse, of the year 2000, when the presidency came down to a recount in Florida that ended at the Supreme Court. To hear the whole story, check out Fiasco, Bush v. Gore, a podcast from the co-creators of Slow Burn. Listen on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
So her tactics, I think, will be resonant to a lot of people. You say she's media savvy. She starts calling this the federal financing of a foolish festival for frustrated feminists.
Take that alliteration and media savvy are the same thing, but yes.
How many F's can we throw in there?
It catches the ear, I suppose. But moreover, you know, this is not to minimize this as a stunt. I mean, there were 15,000 people that she gathers to do a counter protest.
Yeah.
I think, we'll get to this because I think it's a key part of the kind of backlash politics. A big part of what they point out is that they paid their own way down there. They didn't get big government to back them, right? So now all of a sudden they've sort of inverted this idea of who's the insurgent here, right? Who's the outsider? And moreover, I think it just continues to be important to point out that, like, it's not just a protest movement, but there are divisions within the conference itself that she's taking advantage of and highlighting. And so there are walkouts from delegates of the conference itself, especially around the question of abortion. But she's both representing people who are at the women's conference and then representing this whole constituency that is looking at it and launching a backlash to it.
Yeah. I mean, it's the question of abortion. It's the question of sexuality. Yeah. It's the question that's really not implicitly stated, but of race is always there. And those fissures that have always been in the women's movement. There have always been these divisions along racial lines and sexuality and class, for that matter. And you might even throw in faith and religion too. Like, all of that is converging in this space, and she is exploiting those divisions and causing, it's divide and conquer in sort of the most classic of formulas.
And in a way in which a lot of these women who are having these fights internally within the women's movement, they believed that progress was kind of inevitable, right? Like that they kept pushing, that the movement would just keep moving forward, and didn't necessarily see Schlafly's vision of just shattering it as something that was kind of on the table, or opposing it or rolling it back. And I think that Schlafly was able to take advantage of, in a way, they were like kind of distracted from fighting off this particular outside force.
And they underestimated her. I think they underestimated her ability, because there is this assumption that, don't all women want this, and again, not a monolith. And so falling on sort of the laurels of thinking that everyone is in solidarity and lockstep was the way that I think Schlafly was able to sort of exploit those holes.
The document that they produce at the end of this conference is called The Spirit of Houston. It includes lines like, "We affirm the right of women to control their own bodies and make their own reproductive choices." It talks about the ratification of the ERA, talks about childcare, violence against women. It includes a line which, was very carefully crafted and controversial, but we must recognize that the oppression of one group of women diminishes the freedom of all. And it says, "Let us leave Houston with a determination that we shall not be divided and we shall not be denied." But I think you're right, Niki. There is that sort of spirit of inevitability that, yes, the arc is going to bend towards justice. We're just here to kind of push it along. And of course, and this is, I think, where we can start to sort of point out this era of backlash politics that we're living in right now. There will be a backlash. There is a backlash. And sometimes the backlash can really feed off of this idea that there's this inevitability, right? That, in fact, is what scares people, that the sort of tides of history are shifting under their feet without them having any say over it.
It feeds the people who are opposed to the changes that are happening, but it also leads to a kind of complacency among activists who also share that belief. I mean, maybe less so activists, but maybe like liberals writ large, who share that belief. Well, progress is inevitable, so we don't have to shore up our back, right? Like it might go slower, it might be more incremental than we would like, but it is inevitable. And so they're not prepared for gains to be rolled back. And then they're caught off guard because they don't have a strategy for what do you do when they take away your reproductive rights, when they take away your rights to marriage equality, when they take away your vaccines. And so we might want to think about how best to shore those up and how we might be served by shedding this belief that progress is inevitable.
I mean, MLK said it best. He was like, change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. Like continuous struggle, unending, relentless struggle, like is what's sort of required. But like you really can't get comfortable. And I do think that you see this happen in a lot of social movements where there is like momentum legislatively. And that's what they had. They had all of this legislation. They had all of these women who had taken up political office for the first time. And it feels like, hey, we're making it. And before you know it, like, all the steam runs out. You run out of gas. And that's kind of what happened in this moment.
Yeah. I mean, look, this late 70s political moment is so resonant to now because you just kind of have this in that case, this sort of post-New Deal liberal era. Now we have this post-Obama liberal era. You have this backlash politics, and then you have this conversation among liberals, Democrats, about whether the path forward is to kind of retreat to the middle or to kind of check back in with the sort of core values and core voters. And that's clearly what's happening now. And I think we saw kind of in the late 70s, the Democratic Party go into a little bit of a defensive crouch for a while, and Reaganism
for like 50 years.
Yeah. You could say that maybe they got their mojo back with Clinton or Obama, but yes, I mean certainly Reaganism became the sort of defining politics of, I think, our modern times in the wake of this destabilizing moment of the late 70s. The other thing that's kind of interesting and resonant to now, and I'm curious about your thoughts, is just this idea that like it is much easier, I don't know, to put it bluntly, it's much easier to be out of power, and it's much easier to rail against something than it is to kind of stand for something. And it takes a lot more work for a party to kind of find its way to stand for something than it does to rail against something. And so if Phyllis Schlafly...
It's even, well, yes, I agree with that. But I also say it's harder to get a victory and hold on to it than it is anything else. Because it's so easy to get comfortable after you've gotten those things that you don't realize that the fight still has to continue, even with the victory.
Right. And I would also layer onto that, it is so much easier to destroy than to build.
Yes.
And when you have a party aiming at destruction, their job is much easier than the party that wants to build something.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we keep running into, is that obstruction only serves the ends of one party. It's not really a tool Democrats can use except to maybe try to save things like the ACA. But if your message is that government works, making government not work isn't a tool in your toolkit.
Yeah. I think that's so resonant to now when I think, there's a big conversation about trying to adopt the tools or techniques of the other party, and it's like, no, there's different. There are asymmetrical goals here, and you have to just be true to kind of what you want to accomplish, not try and just mimic what happens to have been successful most recently. So
finger snaps.
Yeah. I don't know. We're kind of ending on a downer note here, but and so not to layer this even more on, but
keep fighting.
Continuous struggle is an up note. Quote some more King. That was
But I mean, look. We should come back to the central question of why there was not another conference after 77. I mean, I think we know what happens kind of, from Ford into Carter. But, like, why isn't there just at a sort of practical level, why don't they 2 years later, 4 years later get back together and mount another of these? Is it that the kind of political will had just dissipated because of Schlafly, and now they weren't even going to be able to scrape up $5 million again to kind of help put on a big to-do in Houston?
They were in the trenches in a different way.
Yeah.
They were trying again to they lost the ERA, that the writing was on the wall about that by 78. And I think that does sap some of the energy out of the movement. And it also, to once again draw a parallel with our current moment, I think it drew people into a kind of local organizing or smaller kind of organizing in order to shore up their gains, in order to try to think about how they might want to be in the world differently in the future. And these big national and international events weren't necessarily the place they felt called to be in a moment of retrenchment in which they felt something slipping away.
Yeah, I agree with that too. And I do think sometimes you see some of these divisions split off, and maybe they'll have their own conferences and they'll go deeper with their beliefs, but getting solidarity is just one of the toughest things you can do. Yeah, true. All right, well, we will leave it there. I'm glad we got around to this. It feels like we've done so many episodes that have danced around this event and Schlafly, and I'm glad we just sort of spent some time actually discussing it, and it feels, of course, very resonant to right now. But Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.